out well. I'm going to close that other door.
Everything's relative.
Have a great panel.
Okay, so you will. All right, why don't we get started? I am delighted today to welcome Sir Paul Tucker here to campus. We had an event for his last book, and now we're here for the next one, Global Discord. And this is a book that I think it's both inspired by and reminds me of the great books of the Scottish Enlightenment. It ventures forth across many fields of study. We have on today's panel Arnie Westad, a historian and professor also of global affairs, Ian Shapiro, who's a polymath himself and a professor of political science, and myself, an economist. And we are still not covering all of the fields that are necessary for this book. We did try to also have a law professor and a political philosopher on the panel. Ian, you'll have to cover that role as part of your breadth. It really, for those of you who have not had the opportunity to dive into the book, it really is, it is a pleasure the way, and I mean this in a extremely positive way, it's a maximalist exercise, right? There is much of the whole world that is in there that you can get out about these fields and little pieces of it. And so I'm delighted today that we can have a fulsome discussion of it. The way we're going to start is that we're gonna let Paul got to write the whole book, so we're only gonna let him talk 15 minutes. Okay, so he can go about 15 minutes, and then we'll go alphabetically for Ian and Arnie to give some comments. My hope is we'll have lots of time for discussion and questions. If you don't ask good questions, then you're going to be forced to listen to the ones that I have, which are, narrowly to my interests. You don't want that. So with that, let us begin. Paul, take it away.
Well, thank you very much, first of all, Andrew, for having this event at all. I'm really grateful, and I'm really grateful to Arnie and Ian for being on the panel and for you asking them to be on the panel. If you write a book like this, and actually if you've got a background slightly like mine, you can't be at all confident that you're going to be taken seriously. And I may not be by the end of the session. And I'm used to that kind of risk, so that's okay. But I'm very grateful. The second thing I want to say is that somewhere in Yale, and maybe in the room, is a man called Josh Bailey, who used to work in our cabinet office on where kind of security meets economics. And when I was writing the book, I got to know him through somebody, and I would kind of ask him things about the security world. And his generosity at looking at things and pointing me towards things was also really terrific. You must shut me up. So maybe give me a signal at around 12 minutes or something like that. I'm not at all going to kind of describe the whole of the book. I will say something to begin with about the argumentative structure of the book. This isn't how the book's laid out. The book is driven at its core by an attempted contribution to international political theory in terms of an account of legitimacy, and then takes that to international relations, and then in the context of geopolitics, and then to international organizations, and then it applies a set of principles I come up with to the main economic regimes. The first 350 pages are one argument, although an argument that one can pursue at a high level or a lower level. The last 100 pages are applications, and actually you can read those on their own, but one won't know exactly what's driving some of the arguments, or one can skip that. The second thing to say by way of introduction is that this is an attempt to kind of drive a wedge between kind of amoral realist accounts of international relations and idealist accounts of international relations. And I won't say very much about this, but at its heart is the deployment not of Hobbes or Kant, but of David Hume, brought together with a man called Bernard Williams, who was a kind of late 20th century moral and political philosopher and a very brilliant man, who I think, had he lived, would have written about this kind of thing in a much better way. A kind of premise of the book, and something I believe, is that the contest underway between the West, I'll say a bit more about the West later, and the People's Republic will go on for decades and decades, and quite possibly a century. That it will be everywhere and everything, that neither side will be able to knock out the other and is ideological. That it's not therefore like the old Cold War, because that was everywhere and ideological, but it wasn't in everything, because Stalin had essentially taken the Soviet bloc out of our version of the international economy in the late 40s, early 50s. It's not, I would say, like the struggle between my country and the Second Reich at the turn of the 20th century, because that was everywhere and everything, kind of pretty evenly matched. But it wasn't terribly ideological. It was kind of more about raw power than about kind of deeply differing norms of how states should be governed and how the world should be organized. Say a bit more about that in a second. For what it's worth, sitting in a school of management, I mean, it seems to me quite likely that the Chinese economy will stumble fairly badly over the next few years. And if and when it does so, I would expect people in and around Wall Street, in and around the City of London, Frankfurt, and probably in schools of management to say, that's it then, all over, back to normal, just like Japan in the 1990s. I think that would be, even, however loud people are screaming that at the time, unless it destabilizes the Chinese political system, I don't travel with that at all. In fact, if anything, I think China could continue to expand its hard power during a period in which its economy moved sideways. The two other things to say, one of which I think will be relevant to some of you in your future lives. I think this will play out in a peculiar way in international organizations and regimes, because the international regimes and organizations that we have today are creations of the order led by the United States and Western Europe, and later on Japan in the wake of the Second World War. And I think one could see that in some agonizing coming out of them. But more importantly, I think we are in a world where policy silos will cease to exist and are risky. And our generation was brought up in a world where peace could be taken for granted, and siloism was what people did. So the book is multidisciplinary, not just as a kind of measure of my personality or character or preferences or something, although it's certainly that too. It's actually, I think, that breaking down silos is important in the period ahead. So I've got two questions to ask you. I ask this question everywhere, it's not just for you. Who has heard of Document 9 and the 7 No's? Okay, so typically, I've given lots of talks on this book, around 1% of people have heard about it, and the variance is tiny. And I got used to that after a while. To my great surprise, I was in Asia recently, in Southeast Asia, and I got the same result. And I was absolutely gobsmacked by that, which just shows I don't know anything about East Asia, even though I used to live there. So you should definitely, if you take one thing away from this, after this, you should Google Document 9 and the 7 No's. It's on Wikipedia. I can't read it in Chinese. I've only read it in English. I used to be a bureaucrat. It's a very well-constructed document. These aren't quotes. I mean, it's 5 of the no's are telling the Chinese people, Chinese bureaucrats, Chinese NGOs, that they will not promote or discuss the canonical values of constitutional democracy, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, basic human rights. And 2, which I find more amusing, are about not questioning the socialist characteristics of China with China's form of socialism and so on. It is an instruction not to have debate and discussion, not to be open to other things. I think it's a tremendously important document. I want to say something initially on the substance about an example. about the design of the World Trade Organization, which I think is useful because it's the most important of the international economic regimes, and because it kind of illustrates the predicament that we're in and that we didn't anticipate ever being here. So who has heard of the state-owned enterprises subsidy case that went up to the appellate board in the WTO? Yep. Have you heard of it?
Well, I read the book.
Okay. So this is really interesting. So this is about a decade or so ago. So China is using its state-owned enterprises to subsidize exports and other things of businesses across China. And Washington says, you can't do that. These are illegal subsidies under the WTO treaty. You either need to stop, or if you don't stop, we will slap on what are called countervailing measures, which will be tariffs. One thing brings the price down, the other thing kind of pushes them back up. And Beijing responds, no, you can't do that. That would be illegal because our subsidies, they are not illegal. So they got a dispute, initially with a small d, then with a big D, goes through the process for adjudicating these disputes, gets to the appellate board. The appellate board rules in China's favor, because although they're subsidies, they're not illegal subsidies, because the state-owned enterprises aren't public bodies in the sense of being kind of an emanation of central government. And there's something kind of slightly crazy about that, given the Chinese system of government, no criticism implied. And I think the US didn't present their case at all skillfully, but there we are on what's to be done. It becomes interesting at this point, I think. So what we'd expect in the old world, a world of diplomacy and bargaining, is America's very irritated, and you can't carry on like that forever. So Beijing and Washington would get together, and they would bargain. And the outcome would be that the US would get some of its losses back, and China would hold on to some of its gains, and at a certain point, the other two great trading powers, the EU and Japan, would be brought into the room, and they'd come up with something, there'd be agreed language, and that would then become, through another process, part of the WTO rules. And there are people in the room who, like me, used to be former central bankers. We've been involved in doing things like that when there are disagreements. Except that under the WTO treaty, everybody has a veto, everybody. And so it's impossible to change the treaty. And it's the next two bits that are interesting. So first of all, the former bureaucrats in the room will recognize this. The people that draft this treaty think it's perfect. Well, they must think it's perfect because they know they're never going to be able to change it. I mean, this is amazing to me, but it is the only solid inference that you can draw. But there's a bigger inference that you can draw, is that the big powers that are designing the WTO, this is before Chinese entry, it's nothing to do with the terms of accession, which were pretty flawed in themselves. The people doing this are thinking, there are going to be irritating things. There are going to be states that breach the rules in certain ways, but none of them are going to matter because none of them are going to be big. So basically, there is no conception of the possibility of a great economic power emerging that doesn't essentially share liberal attitudes towards trade. And if anything is an illustration, concrete illustration, that there was an end of history moment, I think this is it. Because what this says is, although in the previous 2,000 to 3,000 years of history, empires have risen and fallen, that is never going to happen again. This is it. And the effect of all of this is that the WTO is essentially marginalized at the moment, and all of the action is in regional and preferential trading agreements. And some trade scholars, trade lawyers, including Petros Mavridis at Columbia, who's kind of massive figure in this, they are starting to think about how can we use, without abusing the national security provisions, exemptions of the WTO treaty to bring things back into the WTO. But I'm exaggerating, of course, but this is an organization that is just at the moment penned in by geopolitics because it was designed for a world that, for the moment at least, doesn't exist. The book runs with 4 geopolitical scenarios. One is lingering status quo, another one is superpower struggle, new Cold War, and new world order. By new world order, approximately I mean that a state like India has risen, or perhaps Indonesia as well, and a new top table emerges organically. I think people have been blind about that for a while. I'll tell you a true story about my former life when I was a central banker, which I gave up a long time ago. During the crisis, somebody walks into my room, I think I'm deputy governor at that point, and they say, the Federal Reserve just refused India a swap line. And it doesn't matter what a swap line is, it's just a line of credit from one central bank to another, collateralized with the currency of the borrowing country. The technicalities don't matter one iota. All you need to know is that India wanted this thing and the Federal Reserve said no. And my response to the person telling me this is, don't they realize India's going to be a power? And my thought was, well, this is just above the Federal Reserve's pay grade. This is, oh my goodness, I wonder how they're handling Delhi over this. But that's all somewhere in the future. When I started writing the book, I thought we were between lingering status quo and superpower struggle, and now we're somewhere between superpower struggle and new Cold War. I want to say 2 other things and then I'll stop. The first is, as I speak this afternoon, and if you dip into the book, you'll think, oh my goodness, he's one of the people that thinks this is a civilizational struggle. And I've made it sound a bit like that with the ideological slide, the document 9 slide. I don't actually, although I think it will often appear like it. And I think it will feel like it at times. The reason I don't is that I think a tremendously important fact of the world is that there are Confucian heritage states, Korea, South Korea, Japan, and some others in a slightly different way, that are constitutional democracies, have the rule of law, have elections, particularly in South Korea, where power changes hands, and yet haven't lost their sense of history and identity and way of life. Even this thing, constitutional democracy, it might have happened, might have emerged in some haphazard way in the West, but I don't think it's a Western thing anymore. And I think actually we need a different, I think we shouldn't be calling it the West, nor do I think we should be calling it the free world. I don't think we've quite got an expression that captures who we are. But by we, I mean to include countries like that. And this is where I think I'll end, other than for some words on the dollar. I think we're going to live in a world positively and normatively. I suspect we should live in a world where you can think of cooperation coming in concentric circles for any particular state. In the outermost circle, cooperation will be thin. The ambition will be peaceful coexistence, and then maybe existential threats, maybe. That's bound to come up in discussion about climate change. Not so confident about that. But I don't think we should do more than the minimum than is safe with states that violate the peremptory basic rights, peremptory norms of international law, the most basic human rights. Because there's a sense in which, as I write somewhere, if they treat their own people like that, how would they treat us if they could? And so I am a supporter of what's become de-risking, decoupling, and that's been my view for many years. But I see that there is a risk that could overshoot, driven by domestic politics here and parts of Europe and in Beijing, in ways that kind of impoverish the world. But nevertheless, I think that this is symmetric. I think neither we nor they should leave ourselves in a position, or themselves in a position, where we are avoidably vulnerable to independencies. And I think the goal should be to reduce the probability of conflict. The second circle, I'm not going to go through them all, is a world where actually we don't have terribly much in common, whoever we are. Actually, it's a different we now. It's any old we, any state. And we can cooperate in more ways that people that do kind of don't violate the most basic rights, and we don't feel threatened by. But the capacity for cooperation is going to be limited by what we have in common. And I have a great deal to say in the book, drawing on Bernard Williams, about what this kind of means at a kind of conceptual level. And as you go further in, we've got more and more in common, and you can cooperate more deeply, and the EU is an example of that. And you can think of the United Kingdom of it couldn't square the legitimation norms being in the EU with its domestic legitimation norms for the time being. I will say, can I say one thing about the dollar?
Yes.
No. I think this is just to reinforce the silo point. Being the hegemon and the security relations that it generates encourages use of your currency. That was true for my country quite a long time ago. But also being the issuer of the world's dominant reserve currency makes it kind of cheaper to be the hegemon. And when Europe understandably gets frustrated with sometimes the abuse of dollar power, and it is sometimes abused, which is a view held by people that have been Treasury Secretary and have talked about it, Europe needs to be careful not to kind of push the world away from the dollar, because we aren't ready to be a hard power. And actually the world order is, I mean, I think we've got the best deal out of the post-war order. But there's something else I want to say as well, which is more of an economics point. And so standardly, people will say the advantages of issuing the reserve currency is cheaper borrowing costs for the government and for companies, and it helps your banking system, all of which is true. But the really great thing, I think, is that when terrible things happen in the economy, you have a cushion. And so the great financial crisis more than a decade ago, this is brewed here through kind of incompetence and malfeasance and everything bad. And the whole world is falling apart. And if that had happened to if any other country in the world had driven that, its currency would have fallen, and there would have been a bit of a run away from its government securities. Instead, there was a run into short maturity US treasuries. This must have felt like a gift from God to the people sitting in the US Treasury. And it's a miracle that if you were sitting in Beijing, you would want. It would be really peculiar not to want. To be an aspiring superpower, it would be really peculiar not to want to issue the world's most important reserve currency. And when people in our profession, Andrew, say, well, it won't happen because of rule of law and this, that, and the other, I kind of want to say to them, so you put a 0% on that? So where I want to end up, my prescriptions are reduce overdependence, avoid mistakes, and maintain as many friends as you can around the world. I've left out the kind of core driving argument and all of that, the one I really care about, but I'm sitting here rather than in a philosophy seminar.
All right, that's great. That sounds like great advice for us living our own individual lives. Not to have enemies around the world and not to make big mistakes. Seems pretty good. All right, that's a great start for us. I should have said at the outset that there were some different times on written down for when we were going to finish, but the official time we're going to finish is 5:15. I know some people saw 5 o'clock on that. If you need to leave at 5 o'clock, we're all going to stare very angrily at you, but you can go. But otherwise, we're gonna go until 5:15. On China wanting this power, I will say this is a grass is always greener situation. Tim Geithner has often remarked how he would love the power that China had during the crisis to tell the banks who they should lend to and how much they should lend to. All right, without further ado, we will go next to Ian.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing the book with us, and thanks for participating, everybody, in this. I would second all the laudatory things that Andrew said at the beginning about the book. I think of this book, when I think of this book, I think of an oasis. You know, many different animals go to an oasis for water and sustenance. You know, lions, giraffes, hippos, maybe, and can take away things that are important to them. And that's true of this. Now, you know, Arnie is an historian, and I'm a political scientist, and we'll have lots to take away and things to talk about. But that doesn't get into huge chunks of what this book is about, and in particular, Paul spent much of his life, obviously, as a central banker and in public finance. So, Andrew, I hope you're not just going to limit yourself to being a moderator and chip in, but I'll leave it to you to figure out who's the hippo and who's the lion and who's the giraffe. You know? So, and I will also, in the interest of getting into the discussion, I'm not going to talk about the many things I agree with in the book, and really got a tremendous amount out of it. I'm going to instead focus right away on the areas where I have questions. And so, and this, I think, goes to Paul's alternative scenarios for the future, the sort of lingering status quo, some kind of superpower struggle, a new Cold War, or his Humean Bernard Williamsian, cooperative within kind of like-minded groups, structure of the future world order. And I would say, you know, it's global in many respects in this book, but the core of it is really about the US-China relationship. I mean, that's what's going on here. And so I would just make one descriptive point and then one point about the incentives that are created by the system you're advocating. The descriptive point, I just wonder if the underlying structure of international relations isn't a lot more Hobbesian than you want to describe it as being. So, you know, even if you think about the de jure Westphalian system, which you characterize as operating in the 19th century and so on, you know, really as a strictly de jure matter, it operated from 1945 until 2005. This idea that nations are fully sovereign was not enshrined into international law until the UN Charter. And in 2005, you start to get the General Assembly adopting the doctrine of responsibility to protect, which holds governments accountable for gross human rights violations and other things within their borders, and actually empowers the Security Council to empower intervention. So that's at the de jure level, we have, you know, that sliver of time. But de facto, if you think about, you know, even before that, I mean, during the 19th century, well, it might have looked Westphalian among the great powers, but didn't look very Westphalian from the global south that was being colonized left, right, and center. And even during the de jure period, there was plenty of intervention in proxy wars in the Second World, Soviet Union intervening in Eastern Europe periodically. We were, toppling regimes in Iran, and we were toppling regimes in Latin America and Vietnam. So, I think the sort of underlying structure of things, I think is a lot more Hobbesian than you describe. And I think that's an important point for what I want to say next, because I think the underlying realist structure of things is it's much easier for it to reassert itself than your Humean approach might be able to constrain. And in fact, I think when you think about how it might play out, and this is moving now to the incentives it creates, it might actually not be an equilibrium anyway, but it would create incentives for the underlying Hobbesian structure of things to resurface. And I think part of that's exactly what's going on right now. As you say, we seem to be evolving now back towards a new Cold War. So, this idea that we should have our greatest cooperation with the most like-minded friends, and then, circles out and less and less and less as we get to the periphery. And as you say, the EU is a sort of poster child for this. And indeed, people who wanted to join the EU had to meet certain criteria, benchmark criteria of democratic and fiscal policies, and to be accepted to join. And, some countries have been knocking on the door for decades, like Turkey. Yes, it's a group of cooperating, like-minded players. Yes, but, from the point of view of an African farmer, it looks like a giant protectionist club, and it is. And so I think that approach to cooperative behavior of privileging the most like-minded friends is fine if you're basically dealing with price takers who want to join your club. And the US has at times behaved exactly in that way. If you think about, just a few examples occurred to me in the last couple of days. Congress's 1984, they renewed the provisions of the Trade Act authorizing the president to provide tariff relief to developing countries, but they excluded countries that didn't meet certain labor standards.
Yep.
And then that was actually used to exclude a bunch of countries and to suspend a bunch of countries. And similar provisions were put into the renewing the 1983 Caribbean Basin Recovery Act and the 1985 reauthorization of OPEC. And it was this idea that the US could unilaterally require countries who want to trade with us to meet certain normative standards. And the expectation was you would get a lot of compliance because those countries would want to trade with us. And so they were essentially price takers, and that would help in that respect. But we're talking about the US versus China. And the whole problem with China is it's decreasingly a price taker. What's really needed is cooperation with China on everything from global warming to many other topics. And so I wonder, wouldn't this, in fact, as you yourself say in the book, the authoritarian systems with different values would have their own concentric circles.
Yes.
So how could this not lead to a new Cold War is sort of what I came away thinking. And I think that, if you really think about trying to create a less malevolent order, we need to think about the fact that in a Cold War, you're trapped in a prisoner's dilemma. And the question is, how do you get out of the prisoner's dilemma? I don't see anything. Not only do I see nothing to get out of it, I see it as reinforcing that. If you want the counterfactual, I mean, let's step back a minute and think about Nixon's opening to China. Now, Nixon's opening to China, as you say in the book at one point briefly, in part it was just a move in the Cold War to divide and conquer with respect to the Soviet Union, yes, but it was also an attempt to engage in a cooperative move with China with a view to changing the U.S.-China relationship and to open up possibilities of trade and investment with China. The expectation being perhaps naively that, du commerce would eventually turn China into a liberal democracy. Nonetheless, if you think about the game theoretic structure of these things, the way to break out of a prisoner's dilemma is precisely to make moves that are medium stakes. They're not so high that you'll be dead if you're wrong or something like that, but they're not so low that they're irrelevant. But medium stakes cooperative moves that create the incentive on the other side to reciprocate. And so that is exactly the kind of move that Nixon's opening was from this perspective. You want medium stakes cooperative moves that are going to can prompt cooperation into the indefinite future. And I don't see where that happens in this system. Now, it is true that the China relationship with the U.S. has changed, and I think it's because when we did that opening to China and we started trading with them and so forth, everybody knew they were cheating all the time on intellectual property, and they were subsidizing their industries, as you say, and so on and so forth. We didn't really care because they were so far behind, we thought it just didn't matter. And of course, as that starts to matter, it becomes more complicated, and starting with the Obama administration and TPP, and then Trump, and now Biden, we've decided, yeah, it matters big time. And also, we're now running scared of Sanders voters and Trump voters at home and so forth. So it's very hard to sustain these things. But the fact that, that particular opening now has become much harder to sustain, it still seems to me what we really need in the U.S.-China relationship is this kind of cooperative intervention at the sort of medium stakes level to find ways to get out of the emerging, if it hasn't already emerged, prisoner's dilemma we got trapped back into, which is a new Cold War. And I don't see anything, I mean, I listened to the podcast, I'll finish with this. I listened to the podcast about your book at Columbia. And
with Petros.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you yourself, I think you were talking about the role of inflation targets in setting central bank monetary policy. And in that example, I think what you said was spot on. You yourself said it was very good that the Fed didn't unilaterally, set down, say what everybody should do.
Yes.
They didn't have the power to do it at the time.
Yes.
But it was a very good thing because it functionally became kind of leading from behind. and it didn't give the Chinese a reason to not do it.
Yeah.
And so, it seems to me that, again, is much more in the spirit of, even if it wasn't intentional, Nixon's opening to China and its effects, because it produced cooperation across these groups, which, in the worst case scenario, your approach seems to me pushes in the opposite direction. Why don't I stop there?
I know Paul wants to respond, and it's going to be fun when he does, but let's go first to Artie.
Yeah.
So I will be brief so that we have some time to discuss this afterwards and for you to ask questions. So first of all, let me congratulate you on what is a tremendously rich book. I mean, it's one of the most interesting books in terms of how you combine various aspects of international politics together that I have read for a very long time. And even if you disagree, when you pick up the book, even if you disagree with parts of it, all of you are going to disagree with parts of it. That makes it even more important in many ways that you read the book and start thinking about this in ways that are not in any way, at least to me, given before you actually start looking at it. And that's pretty high praise for a book. And I was very impressed with that. Now, I won't repeat what Ian has said. There are things in here that I would disagree with. There are things that I think are more important than others. Let me just have a go at some of them. So first and foremost, with regard to the international system that we are looking at now, that's sort of one of the big issues that we deal with in the book. Where are we at the moment, and where are we heading? And one of the questions that you raised, which I think is fascinating and really important for today, is the US-China rivalry that we're looking at now more similar to Germany, Britain, anno 1900, or France, Britain, anno 1750,
Yes.
or
Yes.
thereabouts?
Yes.
Now, of course, both of those ended in wars. So some people would come and say, well, does it really matter? It does matter, right? Because how these wars came about and what they resulted in was determined by what went before, the kind of relationship that was there before. Not just for the warring parties, but for the international system as a whole. So I would love to say that the current relationship between the United States and China looks more like France, Britain, and now 1750, which seems to be where you are heading. But I'm afraid that it, to me, increasingly looks like Germany, Britain in the late 19th century. And that we, over the past year or so, have seen more evidence that it is moving in that direction. Now, this is not an historian trying to say that history repeats itself. It doesn't. But it is very strange to see how many echoes of the late 19th century and very early 20th century that now seems to come back to me, including many of the points that you make in it about the links between security, trade, and economics on a very broad scale. But also this sense, very different from the US-Soviet Cold War, of ideologies coming in almost as a kind of afterthought. It becomes something under which the competitive relationship is subsumed and therefore also becomes increasingly important. This is exactly what happened to Germany and Britain towards the end of the 19th century. Right? And became then a striking rationale for war, or at least for continuing the war when it had broken out disastrously in the summer of 1914. Another reason why I think we are probably better off, however scary it is, to think of this not as a Cold War, not as a France-Britain situation of the mid-18th century, but more like a Germany-Britain situation, is that I'm not sure whether we are heading towards more bipolarity. I think over time, and I think we can see some evidence for that today, that we are heading towards a more multipolar system, with two countries being by far the most significant poles within that system. And this is, again, much more similar to some of the challenges that existed in terms of keeping the peace at the beginning of the 20th century. It was exactly that multipolarity that even great powers that were not as great as the leading poles could act on their own that landed us in the disaster of 1914. I was in Washington last week and spent a lot of time discussing this with various people. You can look it up. We had a CSIS discussion between me and Mike Beckley, where he was arguing that this is a new Cold War, and I was arguing, no, it's much worse than that. And at the end of it, of 800 people or so who were there, I think I was able to convince one person to change his or her position at the end of it. That's how entrenched this now has become in Washington. So that's where I stand on that. So then, of course, there is the question, crucial to where we move further, or what China actually wants to achieve.
Yeah.
So I do not see today's CCP leadership as being a leadership that is moving in the direction of the kind of global control that we saw both superpowers trying to achieve during the Cold War. We might get there. And what they're trying to do is in many ways bad enough. They are trying to become the predominant power in Eastern Asia, right, which is the most dynamic region, I mean, from India to Sakhalin,
Yes.
in terms of economic affairs, and increasingly, I think, also in terms of global politics. So maybe that doesn't change things all that much. But it is important to state it, because it has consequences for how China sees its own role and how others see China with regard to global international affairs. Right? Will China and the United States be fighting proxy wars in Ethiopia or Angola anytime soon? My guess is not. I mean, I don't think that is going to happen. It's bad enough with regard to Eastern Asia, of course. Your views on the role of commerce, I found endlessly fascinating in terms of this book, in part because I'm dealing with some of those issues with regard to the 19th century myself. Now, the protagonist of my new book is a Scotsman from the early 19th century, who of course read Adam Smith and Hume, when he was a child. And Smith is fascinating on this, as many of you will know, because he actually believed in this stuff. He believed that commerce and free trade would be an instrument for peace.
Yes. Which Hume didn't really.
Which Hume didn't, to the same extent at least. Adam Smith was also an anti-imperialist, which was very different from many others in the tradition that he stood in. Is it possible to imagine commerce in the kind of Adam Smithian kind of approach as the gentle civilizer of nations, to borrow a term that's often used about international law, as many of you would know? This is one of the biggest questions I think we are heading into, and you seem to hedge slightly towards the end with regard to this.
Yes.
You start out emphasizing the significance of this in terms of potentialities, and then you stop.
Yes.
So I'd be very interested in hearing more about that. I think the way you deal with international relations theory is wonderful. I'd expected Ian to comment on this, that you move wonderfully between various theoretical frameworks, which normally would infuriate political scientists, not Ian, but other political scientists, right? You borrow from realism, you borrow from British school approaches, which I think is great. But obviously, you would have had some pushback from some political scientists with regard to this. And then finally, the book ends, I think, in a great way with actual prescriptions for improving things. And I wish more books that dealt with geopolitical, geoeconomic scenarios for the future were willing to take the risk of actually doing that. But I had one question, I'll end on this, with regard to where you ended up in your presentation here this afternoon. And that's about Senior Arch internationalizing the renminbi and what that would actually mean for international politics in terms of the prescriptions that you lay out. Would it make conflict more likely or less likely? We know that this is a discussion. I think now the discussion is ended for now. But it was a discussion that was there in Beijing just after Xi Jinping became China's paramount leader. We know that he was very keen on moving further in internationalizing renminbi. And it was one of those few ideas that he came into office with, where they were, most of his advisors, from very different standpoints, were able to rein him back. They were basically saying, you know, what you commented on earlier on, you know, imagine if we had had the crisis of the late noughties, right? And China would have an internationalized renminbi. It would have been disastrous. We can't take the risk. We, as the CCP, cannot take the risk of internationalizing like that. But since they were arguing that, Paul, maybe there is a reason to argue for it, right? In terms of tying China into an international commercial system in a way that actually could have an effect on stability and peace.
Okay, that's a lot, but he's been taking notes furiously. So I think he has some thoughts. Back to you, Paul.
I'll say one higher level thing, and then I'll say something about commercial society, which I think links what you are both saying. First thing is that at the heart of the book, so Arne referred to this, that the caricature of international relations theory is that some people think everything's about power and everything else is epiphenomenal, and they're interested in war and peace, and they think Hobbes is the source of wisdom. And then there's a group of people taking their cue from Kant who think the essential thing is values. And interestingly, they will tend to write about human rights and poverty and development. And then there's an intermediate group who often take their cue from Grotius, but with thinner foundations, who think actually it's about interdependence and therefore about interests. And so long as interests somehow coincide temporarily or for a while, then cooperation is possible. And they will tend to study international regimes of various different kinds, and in particular economic regimes and trade. And what I try to do in the book is to say, well, first of all, I suspect that everyone here thinks that power and interests and values all matter. And if you were sitting in a policy seat, I think you'd certainly think they would all matter. And the way cutting through this, which I won't elaborate on now, is I think found in David Hume, because he tells a story where an institution like promising, making promises and keeping formal promises, is partly based on social norms that develop out of habit and that we internalize and we reflect on. And therefore norms inflect the way we pursue interdependence and our interests, and also up to a point help put some parameters around some kind of battle of powers. Basically a Humean story, and I try to set this out, can encompass all of powers and interests and values. I mean, this is partly, the book in which he did this, by the way, he wrote in his mid-1920s. And there is proto-game theory in book 3 of the treatise, which really isn't recaptured, not even with the beginnings of game theory, not until you've got games embedded in games and the kind of stuff that Roger Myerson has done that have won the Nobel Prize, all without notation. I mean, this is a young man, because he was a young man of absolutely staggering brilliance. And I think everybody should, I mean, all really important debates are still debates between Hume and Kant. I'll come back to why I'm saying all of that in a second, or perhaps now. So, Smith is really optimistic that this commercial society thing, which just means exchange, it's what happens after feudalism is that my forebears are allowed to leave their village and can sell their labor. They're not tied to one particular piece of land as a peasant, and they have access to the king's courts as well as to manorial courts. This is an extraordinary moment in the history of freedom in the West. And that world of exchange, when it reaches between princes, between states, Smith is incredibly optimistic about, as in a way was Montesquieu, I think. And Hume is has that optimism, but also there's a jealousy of trade as well. This can bring that can bring conflict. And my view is that Smith is kind of right in the longer run, but it's hazardous to bank on it in the short run. So if we go back to when China was liberalizing economically, without hindsight, I can say I thought at the time, it's a great mistake to think that it will definitely lead to political liberalization. It certainly might. To put all our chips on it, I thought was, for the West to put all their chips on it, was, I thought, a mistake. And I think the way through the problem that Ian identifies is that my outer circle, everyone's got their inner circles, but only a few have got, everybody's kind of in the outer circle. This is a world where it's peaceful coexistence plus trade that is not threatening to us. And I think the dilemma you rightly identify is that if the starting point is one, well, our trade and cross-border investment is so extensive that it is dangerous to us, is that how can we retreat, de-risk, decouple to kind of just the right point or just the right zone? It's not one point, it's a zone, without overshooting. And if we don't overshoot, then the kind of Smithian optimism will tend to work, I think, in the long run, which could be 50 years, 100 years. Two other things. One is, of course, all of these examples, Britain and the Second Reich, even Athens and Sparta, and the Cold War are instructive. I think what's instructive about Britain and France is I don't see a set of circumstances where the United States, the West, and China is going to be able to knock the other out. I mean, Germany lost the First World War, and with a catastrophe in between, they lost the Second World War. The thing about China and Britain is from 1689 until 1815, actually, it's a kind of stalemate where there's rapprochement for a period. In the middle of the 18th century, I can't remember exactly when, they agree a trade treaty. And then they fall out again and they have kind of little wars all over the place. And this is a framework where the War of Independence here is partly a proxy war. The truly first global war is France versus Britain. And it's the French blockade here that kind of makes the difference and our unwillingness to invest sufficiently given other stuff. And then at the end, it's like the thing that you were focusing on in that we can't knock France out without a huge alliance. You know, for anyone that's seen the film, there's Wellington saying, "Where is Blucher?" It's an incredibly extraordinary and informative cinematic moment. And yet in between times, they do things together and then they fall out again. And I think it's just going to be more like that. But the big thing is I think it's going to be a long time rather than a short time. I want to say something about Ian's point, which is quite right, about the Global South and its prescription-wise. I think the West, there are some people in the room that like me have been part of this, even more part of this. I think the West made a great mistake in trying to prescribe to the rest of the world how they should organize their economies. I've basically gone off completely the standards and codes approach for the world. There is a moment in the British Parliament in, I don't know, the 1840s or something, where Palmerston, who's a hawk and isn't quite yet Prime Minister, wants to go and beat somebody up for irritating us. And former Prime Minister Peel, who actually reformed the Bank of England for the central banks in the room, he stands up and he says, "You have got to let these people find their own way to liberty. This is not something that we can do for them." And I think that's basically where I am in my thinking. I think the West has made a great patronizing mistake in that you should be like this. I mean, a theme of the book, not one I'm exhibiting now, is that thick values matter, ways of life matter, and you can't expect to turn up and say, you should have our thin values because you'll be better off if you do. So I'm a bit more hands-off, but that also means not doing other things that at times people would want us to do. I think that's enough. I do think, I haven't focused on the renminbi thing, that come up in discussion, but I do think this point about commercial society is important. And a kind of plug for Hume is, he's writing about the balance of power and commercial society and monetary affairs, but alongside a kind of much deeper account of cooperation that is both explanatory and has a normative edge, which is to do with reflection, which is probably too much philosophy for here.
All right, well, I have one follow-up question to this conversation. I want to ask something that I think is follow-up and not a completely new thing. I'm at some disadvantage in discussing these very sophisticated topics. It's really helpful to have an exotic accent. I do not have one. I just sound like a kid from Long Island.
No, you do.
You're the good ones, and mine is so boring.
It depends where you sit, you see.
But I was,
You
but I
remind
want
me of the guy who says, I'm just a country lawyer.
Matlock. That's Matlock.
No, exactly.
But what I want to ask is, maybe if we think, if somebody thinks that perhaps the place where we need cooperation and a way to figure out how to work together the most is in climate change. Let's say that's a reasonable argument. And then I look to what looks to be in your case studies as perhaps the most successful example. And I say, what are the lessons from that? I'm going to say the Basel Committee.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so you go through several case studies, and one is the Basel Committee, and there's a lot about that section of the Basel Committee that is very encouraging. Like, here's what they did, here's how they managed to inculcate a culture of it. I wonder, did that work? Is that working mostly because the questions are, to most people, not to me and you, small and technocratic, and not the kinds of things where you can inculcate a culture of people across different countries who all are kind of technocrats thinking about bank capital and the questions that it raises, and it's not obviously ideological in any way. Could we ever take a case study for how we've done this success story of the Basel Committee and transform it into anything as massively consequential as climate change?
It's a really, really great question. Actually, the first thing to say is I'm just thrilled you've recognized the point of the chapter, because the point of the chapter isn't that I used to do that stuff. I mean, actually, I don't have any need to write about what I used to do, because I used to do it. It's that actually it's an example of cooperation being almost entirely organic. It starts a bit small, had a few people, actually started in the United States and the UK, then bring in Japan, that was a big deal, then bring in the EU, they were really irritated not to be there to start with, and some people were very diplomatic about it, and so on and so forth. And some sense of common dangers, shared dangers, roughly approximate way of thinking about the world, kind of all part of that. I think, and it's just much less brittle than the IMF or the WTO. It operates variable geometry and adaptive variable geometry to bring people in and out, so nothing comes out of Basel now that is not endorsed by China and Mexico and Korea and all sorts of other countries. But it germinates sometimes in smaller groups. If you compare that with COP, there are too many people at COP to achieve anything. There are really great negotiations. I say something, and Bill says, you actually can't mean that from your own point of view, because, and we've all done that. I've done that. I used to spend much more time briefing myself on other countries than briefing myself on my own when I was negotiating. so that you could understand their constraints. And actually, they made missteps. That's not something you can do with 200 people watching, because it's impossible for the person to say back, as I have on at least one occasion, yeah, you're right, actually, thanks. Oh, shit. The big point you raise is, well, how can you do that when the whole of the, when it's become, has the moment been, I think it could have been done. I think I'm confident in saying if they had started early enough, they could have done something like that. The question is, could they do it now? Much, much harder than what I described. What I would do if I were them is I would have a go, and I wouldn't tell anybody that I was doing it until anything like results had been achieved. I absolutely would tell people before the results had been, you know, crystallized in a hard way, but I would see how far one could get outside of a forum with 200 countries in the room and thousands of NGOs watching, and where you can't have a discussion. What's actually special about I preferred the Basel stuff much more than my day job, because it was just a proper discussion. It was really great. The Fed didn't like it so much, I think, because the Fed was squeezed between the domestic Congress and the international thing. We didn't face that problem to the same extent. But I think, I'm going on too much, but I think trying something organic, I think it's much less likely to work in this field than in what we're talking about for the reasons that you say, but I still have a go, because I don't think the COP thing is is unlikely to work.
All right, we've left you with an enormous amount of time to ask questions on this very short and easy to read book, easy to understand book. Chris.
So I'm curious, so looks like a lot of the dimensions where essentially the economic side of this is happening now is, it's policies like China's Belt and, It's policies like China's Belt and Road Initiative, building infrastructure projects, building naval ports in Peru that look like they have both essentially a positive sum element, which is building new infrastructure, and then maybe it's being used to pursue a negative sum goal, like a new naval port for conflict with the US. I'm curious, to what extent do you think kind of economic initiatives for geopolitical power will take on positive versus negative sum dimensions?
I think if you're Beijing, and actually the West, if they get their act together, is you want to kind of maximize optionality on this, that you do something that can be positive sum if the world remains nice, but actually has equipped you with, well, for a zero-sum game if the world turns nasty. And I think they've played, I think this is one thing they have done very well, particularly with ports, Panama Canal, all sorts of places. And I think that should be kind of the measure, rather than, or at least should be one measure, rather than whether they're investing their vast external surplus wisely. And I think that the West was a bit dozy about spotting this. But I think it's optionality where it can be one or the other. And the other thing I would say is, in tracking this, I think a really important thing, which comes back to what does China want, actually, is when they start having little military bases. So there's one in Djibouti at the moment. And I think my answer to what China wants, and lots of people write papers about this, I don't think many of them are worth reading, because I don't think, how can China possibly know what it wants? But the United States, for a very long time, really did not want to be a global power. Even after the First World War, even going into the Second World War, China has a tiny handful of bases around the world. The United States has 800. Even my country started off thinking, oh, we'll have some entrepôts here and there. And then, the people are causing a bit of trouble. We need to kind of keep the entrepôt protected, and ended up, with the disgusting thing it ended up with. People don't know where they're going to be led through what they see are the protection of their interests. But I think the fact that they've gone for infrastructure and ports is a big deal.
The question here. Yes.
Thank you so much. Paul, I have a question about a concept that you developed at length in your previous book, legitimacy. Because the world order that would result from your solution, I wonder what kind of legitimacy it would have if it's just the byproduct of some countries cooperating with their own circles and versus other countries cooperating with their own circles. And I worry about that, not just for the more realist reasons that Ian evoked, which is that that's not going to lead us to a solution to the prisoner's dilemma, but also because it's not going to lead us to a legitimate sort of world, and not just, but legitimate world order where you have populations that can embrace and support and make this system stable. And we see it's falling apart, and that the current institutions, the UN, they're not democratic, they're not representative, they're not very legitimate. They're the best we have, but it's not great. And with all the problems that we have, AI regulation, climate justice, there's got to be some kind of convergence and some kind of value convergence on some issues at least. And I just don't see that happening from just the, it's not do commerce, but the invisible hand of something here bringing people together. So, and just I'll throw one last idea, because of course I can't help thinking from the perspective of my own work, which is advocating citizens' assemblies. I think one way to solve a prisoner's dilemma is through deliberation. You get the parties to talk to each other in a place where they're equals. And it's not going to happen in the international system where it's too biased at this point. But you could think of things like global citizens' assemblies where maybe these conversations could be had in sincerity and authenticity. And I know that it's talked about at the UN 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, when they had those meetings. I think we've got to think radically, boldly, and I wonder whether Hume is still the right framework for this.
So legitimacy is the core of this book too, in fact, notwithstanding the way I presented it today. And jumping over many steps, I kind of set up a tension between endogenous legitimation norms at home. So this starts with Williams's first political question of order, safety, protection, and so on, conditions of cooperation, and the legitimation norms we have are not Kantian. We don't pick them off the shelf, but they're determined in part by the path of problems and opportunities we've faced, how we've solved them, and so on. And countries have their own legitimation norms, which are kind of part of their way of life, actually the deep fabric of their society, I think. And then outward looking, there's a set of international norms that, to a greater or lesser extent, underpins the international system. A balanced power system has a different set of international norms from a hegemonic system. There are questions about how far should the global south, as it happens to be today, acquiesce or not. What can they do about that? And I think that, though, where things get awkward is where the domestic legitimation norms are in tension with the outward-looking norms, the vertical norms or the horizontal norms, if you like. I think we are in a position where that's the case in a big way, because essentially China does not accept the legitimacy of the international system or even the global order that we have. In a sense, I didn't put this quite like this in the book. I think we need to, and that combined with the fact that there's so much overdependence in both directions makes the world a dangerous place, I think. And I suppose what I'm prescribing is, and this is what Ian challenged, is, and I accept the challenge, is that we should kind of retreat to a point where there's still the tension in legitimation norms, but the world isn't quite so dangerous. Because, I don't know, that we aren't capable of switching off their economy and vice versa. I've been in circumstances where people have talked about, well, we could switch off the peninsula. And they don't mean with guns. And I don't even know, I've been out of this for 10 years. I don't know what can be done now, but I shouldn't think it's less than I kind of had a glimmer of. So then I think I want to take the this is really dangerous stuff out of it, which I think de-risking can do in degree, although Taiwan will still be there as a potential flashpoint. The Indian-Chinese border will still be there as a flashpoint. And then actually, the kind of thing you describe, I would be in favor of. I think that working in parallel with commerce, I do think commerce helps. I do think, you know, ordinary middle-class people working in merchant firms and exporters and on the phone and mailing and so on, I do think all of that helps, because what it brings is a kind of, oh, they're a bit like us. They're a bit like us. And I think that's a very potent thing. But I want to de-risk the world, and then I'm on for it, yeah, experiments of the kind. But legitimacy is absolutely the heart of it.
That's a great place to end. We should stop here, but
We'll hang around.
Thank you both very, very
Pleasure.
You probably didn't meet. No one in the school knows anybody else.
No, but it's a very good way of stopping it. Why you say between 2015
Sorry about that. I just kind of want to look.
I arrived there late 2007. Okay, we're in the unit of the side of it first.
Yes, indeed.
But I walked Robert. I'm sure he doesn't.
I'll see you at dinner.
I'm so sorry, I can't join for dinner. I would have loved to. I have a guest.
Columbia go up Tuesday?
Right.
I'll wait. I think it's Friday the 1st.
I spent a lot of my time.